Hi everyone, in the previous two videos I showed you how to override command box config settings with environment variables and how to override server.json values for any server with environment variables. Today we have a third part of this trifecta, which is the ability to override your CFConfig settings, also with, guess what, environment variables. So CFConfig is a module you install in a command box and it loads all of your configuration for your web servers that you start using command box. So Lucee, Adobe, whatever version, doesn't matter. CFConfig can also be used to manage configuration for non-command box servers, but this environment variable override trick only applies to command box servers because it's part of the on-server start interceptor. So this is part of the magic that happens when you type server start in command box. So CFConfig has support for pretty much everything you can store inside of the ColdFusion administrator for Lucee or Adobe. Data sources, mail servers, request timeouts, event gateways, scheduled tasks, you name it, it's all there in the JSON structure. So here in the docs, cfconfig.ortusbooks.com, we have a quick overview of what this looks like. So you may recall the previous two types of environment overrides all started with box_config or box_server. In this instance, our environment variables just start with CFConfig_ and then the name of the CFConfig setting. So that would be the name of the key from the CFConfig JSON file. Again, case sensitivity does not matter. Whether it's upper or lower case, it will get picked up because command box is just cool like that. So in its simplest form, CFConfig_admin password would set the plain text password of whatever server you're starting. So when the server starts, CFConfig sees this environment variable, it finds it by convention, and it will override, it will have the final say, even if you have an admin password set in your JSON files you may be overriding. So these always get layered on top. That's the general rule with environment variables. You can drill down and you can overwrite very specific pieces of existing configuration. So this works perfectly to layer on top of existing JSON files. So in this example here, we would have CFConfig_data sources _name of your data source _password equals my pass. So this would override just the password field of the my DSN data source and would set it to my pass. So this allows you to kind of layer on some overrides on top of maybe your JSON defaults that maybe you want to change on the fly in your container. And you don't necessarily, you could use a placeholder in the JSON for the password. There's nothing wrong with that. But maybe the JSON file doesn't have a placeholder in place. Maybe it had a hard-coded password. You can still overlay that with this. And of course, as usual, you can always specify just raw JSON. So if you wanted to specify the full array of mail servers, you could just specify an array of objects in JSON, and then that would just be it would be appended into the existing mail servers that are present. So by default, these will get loaded into the Lucee server context, or if it's Adobe ColdFusion, there's only one context, doesn't matter. If you're doing anything related to, say, logging settings or scheduled tasks, you can use this convention, CFConfig_web_ and then the name of the setting you want. And for an Adobe server, it'll just import like normal. For a Lucee server, it'll go specifically into the web context. So let's take a couple look at some examples of doing this. First of all, I have a little trick I like to use locally. I use the command box.env module, and that allows me to have a .env file in the root of my projects. It also allows me to have a global .box.env file in my user home directory. These environment variables here will always get picked up every time I start command box, and you can see I'm using a couple of these environment variables to provide basically global defaults. So every server I ever start on my computer will always have an admin password of password. And yes, that is literally the password I use because I don't want any real passwords showing up when I do things like screencasts. So on my local computer, that is literally my administrator password. And I also have a really handy Lucee setting, buffer tag body output, which allows you to dump an abort inside CFCs where output is equal to false. So these are some environment variables that just always exist everywhere. And in fact, if we finally jump over to command box and I run env show, we can see we're picking up both the env file in my current folder, which is just a ColdBox application skeleton. And we also see my CFConfig admin password and my CFConfig buffer tag body output, which came from that global env file. So we can add a couple more ad hoc environment variables. So let's override my data source password, because if we look here, so this is just my ColdBox app template that I dumped in this folder. Have something interesting to look at. If we look at this, ColdBox, I just so happen to know, comes with, I didn't mean to do a directory listing on that. I meant to dump out the contents of the file. ColdBox comes with a default data source whose name is going to be ColdBox. And let's say I want to override that default password that's done here with a placeholder. So let's do set, copied that wrong thing to my clipboard. We'll just type it, CFConfig _ data sources _ and then ColdBox is the name of the data source _ password equals Brad. Okay, so I've also set that in as just an ad hoc environment variable that's just going to live for as long as the shell is open. So if I go ahead and I start the server, again, I'm going to use our verbose flag because there's going to be a bit of output that lets us know what environment variables were loaded by CFConfig. This is great for debugging because you want to be able to tell if those environment variables worked that you put into place. So under our section that says loading CFConfig into server, there's a handful of things that happened. It found a cfconfig.json file, which came with that ColdBox app template. And then it also found 3 environment variables, admin password, buffer, tag body output, and my ColdBox password override. And so it tells us that it imported the password and buffer tag body output, and it merged those data source settings. So that's basically it. Here comes our web browser. You don't necessarily need to see it though. You just set those environment variables, you start the server, they get automatically picked up. Use this verbose output, which you also see if you use the debug flag, and that way you can tell if your environment variables are being picked up and if they're being used. And this allows you to really layer on kind of fine-grained control over your CFConfig settings, even on a even on a Docker image that already has, the JSON file built in, or any other non-Docker command box deployment. So that is it, and have a good one.